And it's 2 o'clock, time to start with a webinar on dynamic space management in cooperation with the MORE project. We'll give it a second for more attendees to arrive, but I'll anyway go into a bit of an introduction, which is more general, so you're not, people who arrive late will not have missed a lot, but just to say that this is a webinar part of a series of webinars called Mobilising Mobility, where we as Polis, a network of cities and regions, try to turn European transport innovation into local action. We try to link insights from European research projects, other research and innovation projects, and also our members' activities into interesting content for you to understand hot topics on the current in urban mobility at the moment. This is a timeline for the webinars in October. I'm not going to read them aloud, but we are covering a lot of ground here. So do keep a look at what is next and what can be interesting for you. Today's webinar is about dynamic space management, and we added to the title, "Are we there yet?" So we notice in our Brussels bubble, in our secretariat, that there's a lot of energy surrounding the topic of dynamic use of urban space. COVID also has shown that urban space is a very scarce resource that needs to be treated carefully. And one of the ways to better use the urban space is to give it a dynamic use and to repurpose urban space throughout seasons, throughout months, throughout the day even. In this webinar, we'll be listening to 3 people who have looked into the topic. And that is Professor Peter Jones from University College London, who is the coordinator of the MORE project. Craciun from Transport for Greater Manchester will talk about an interesting case she has worked on. And Susan Claris of ARUP will present a study they have carried out on flexible kerb use. First, a couple of rules of engagement. We will record this webinar for future use, so that it also becomes available for people who cannot attend today. And this recording will be shared with you. We also take questions from the audience through the Q&A function or through the chat function. I will be monitoring both of them. And the idea is to have a discussion with the speakers on the basis of your input, if your questions. Do engage also with the projects and with our network through social media. And you also have the websites of MORE and the Polis network on the left corner for you to read more about all the interesting things that happen in the network and in the project. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Peter Jones. I first have to look for the slides, but you'll get that in a minute. Peter.
Thanks very much, Ivo, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'll just give a brief introduction to the MORE project and then talk specifically about how we're dealing with issues around dynamic allocation of road space. Are we there?
Need to share that. Yeah. So that normally should be sharing now.
Yeah, great. So if you go to the second one, please. So MORE stands for, you've gone to the third one.
No,
Multimodal optimization of road space in Europe. And what we're doing is we're working with 5 cities, looking at the existing and future pressures on main roads in the cities, the ones that come in from the 10T networks that connect the urban nodes around Europe, and looking at the routes in major city centres, ports, etc. And what we're doing is we're developing design tools and process processes, or enable those key routes to be better planned, designed, managed and operated in a way that makes them more responsive to existing and future pressures in a flexible way. And we're doing that by looking at possibilities for dynamic space management operation, relying on the growing number of sensors that we have on the streets, and then possibilities of in-vehicle signing, but also using LED road signs and road markings, and also looking at the interface between the urban network and the interurban network, where often there are different priorities and objectives. Next, please. So these are the partners. We have 18 partners. We have 3 universities. We have a number of private sector companies, and then we have Polis and other organizations representing different user groups. And then we have 5 cities. Next, please. And the 5 cities you can see are spread across Europe. They're on different 10T networks. And between the 5 cities, we actually cover 6 of the 10T networks. So we're trying to work with cities along those different corridors. Next, please. We're making a distinction, looking at roads as they come in from the national road network into the city centre. We're making a distinction between what we call roads, which are primarily there for motorised vehicles, and what we call streets, where in addition you have pedestrians and cyclists, but also you have street frontages, you have buildings on either side, you have street activities, place activities, a lot of interaction. And these are very different areas, and it's the latter ones, the streets, that actually pose the greatest challenges, and that's where we're putting most of our efforts. Next, please. So we're looking at the whole design process, and we're coming up with new or improved tools to help policymakers, designers, etc., work with local communities to better design roads to meet existing and future needs. So there are 4 sets of tools. There are tools around generating design options, so that if cities want to improve facilities for pedestrians or whatever, there's a library of options. You can go in and see what might be possible and what experiences there are from elsewhere. And also to encourage you to think of different ways of laying out available space. Secondly, we have a road design stakeholder engagement tool, which is mainly web-based tool to do consultation on different design options, but also to work online, actually designing street layouts using GIS systems. Thirdly, road design dynamic simulator, and there we're building on PTV's Visim software, but adding new functionality to improve the representation of curbside use, and also to include things like place activities on the streets. And then fourthly, we're developing a set of road design appraisal tools that enable you to appraise different design options from a policy priority point of view, from multi-criteria analysis point of view, or from a cost-benefit point of view. Next, please. Now, what's the challenge? Well, clearly on these main roads coming into cities, and particularly when we get to the more intensive street sections with shops, other commercial activities, then there's lots of pressures there, competing demands, but also there are new things that have been coming up in the last 2 or 3 years to add to those pressures and competition for space. We've got new modal options like e-scooters, growing interest in things like home deliveries, partly due to COVID, a much greater interest in place-related activities, again, partly due to COVID, having restaurants and things out on the street, and also, in many cases, a densification of urban populations. But on top of that, if we look ahead 10, 20 years or more, then we're going to go gradually electrification of the fleet. That will mean we'll need more charging points and so on. Potentially autonomous vehicles, road, rail, water and air, advances in traffic control and curbside management systems, new types of sensors giving new opportunities to see how the street's operating in real time, things like self-healing roads to reduce the amount of road closures, and also trenchless technologies and underground logistics, again, to take pressure off the surface network. Next, please. But further than that, there are 2 things we're particularly focusing on. First of all, having reviewed existing advice and guidance on street design and operation, what we tend to see is most of those design guides are mode specific. Whereas in reality, of course, there's all sorts of interaction between different road users. And in fact, looking more broadly, we're looking at the street as an ecosystem, actually saying that there's an interaction between the buildings and the street, in terms of the buildings generating much of the demand for movement to those particular places along the street. We've got the different types of interaction between the footway and the carriageway, different users of the carriageway, We've got things underground that may take pressure off the street, like a metro system, or if we have major utilities, pipes and things, if they burst, then that can disrupt traffic. And equally, in airspace at the moment, GPS rather is proving very valuable in different things, but also we're looking towards drones and things like that will actually increase airspace as a mode of movement. So that's the first area we're thinking about, trying to break down these modal silos, look at the street as a whole. And secondly, to encourage cities to become sufficiently innovative and imaginative in considering options for the allocation of urban street space. So next, please. Here's a very simple example of one of the tools that we've developed. It's now improved since this slide, but tool we're developing, looking at a cross-section on a street and saying, right, we've got the pavement or footway, we've got the carriageway, maybe a median strip, and then a carriageway, footway and buildings either side. And it might be you want to provide for pedestrians, buses, cycles, cars, etc. And within a certain road width, there are many different ways that you can lay out that space. And we tend to look at things conventionally, having things in certain places, bus lanes next to the curb often, and so on, or cycle lanes next to the curb. But this just encourages you to think of different ways you could lay out that space, just to try and be a bit more imaginative. Next, please. And what's really helped us actually is COVID, because in a short space of time, many cities have dramatically, because partly of the reductions in car use at that time, but also to make more space for safe walking, cycling, and encouraging public transport use, then in a very short space of time, space has been dramatically changed. So providing much more space for buses, or top right is Boston, where what used to be just a road for general traffic has now got a wide cycle lane, it's got a wide bus lane and so on. Bottom right is Paris, for example, bottom left is Lisbon. So in a very short space of time, things have been introduced that even a year or two ago, people would have not even thought would be possible. So we're trying to encourage that imaginative and innovative thinking in the way in which people approach this design exercise. Next, please. So is dynamic space allocation the solution? Well, clearly on busy urban streets, we're looking at high streets and things like that. User needs are very varied, they're many varied, and they're complex, and they change from hour to hour and day to day, as Ivo said. And at the moment, our scope for adapting space and capacity is limited. It's often binary, so this is either a bus lane in the peak and parking off peak, and often can only be changed infrequently. Once you've introduced these markings and things, it may be several years before there's a chance to do a review. Obviously, dynamic space allocation would much better match supply and demand on an hour-by-hour basis, but it sounds good in theory, but there are a lot of issues to take into account in practice. Next, please. Before I go into that, here's an example of some work done in West London on a sort of high street with shops and offices and things like that. And this just summarizes what the regulations are through the day on different days of the week. And you can see that the regulations tend to change between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. At different days of the week, there are different amounts of curb space available for loading in this particular case. But there's a limit to how much you can do that, and it tends to be fixed, as I say, for years at a time, and it's a rather binary, you can or you can't, over a period of a day. Next, please. And this next slide actually shows what happens in practice along that same stretch of road. The dotted blue line indicates the amount of curb length actually legally available for parking. The dotted yellow line shows the amount of space actually available for loading, and the dark blue rather jagged line going along there actually shows the observed amount of parking. So there is actually illegal parking there. There's more parking actually happening than there are legal spaces. But equally, the yellow line along the bottom there shows that the demand for loading is actually much less than actually is available. So that suggests that matching isn't quite right. And obviously that can vary, particularly seasonally. We know near Christmas, for example, shops tend to have many more deliveries and so on. So if we could actually, at least seasonally or maybe weekly or daily, if we could have some variation in how we allocate the available space, then we can make more efficient use of it. Next, please. So now the question is, how dynamic could we go? Now, The best examples so far are advanced junction traffic signal controls, where the most advanced ones have a set of sensors and they adjust the signal timing second by second. But essentially, it doesn't really affect very much. The road layout's exactly the same. The vehicles wait in the same places. They just don't know exactly when they're going to get a green. And there you can be very flexible. But when we think about translating that to links, we have to think about where we regulate, what people can do, how and where. So things like switching a traffic lane into a bus lane, or replacing curbside parking with loading as demand varies, as I showed you just now in the previous slide. And that raises some quite basic questions. How often could allocations be changed without causing confusion and resentment? You certainly couldn't do the same as a traffic signal, change it second by second. What would be reasonable? Would people expect similar sort of things on different days? If you turned up in a car, would you expect, or a vehicle, loading vehicle, would you expect to be able to get to the same space every day? Particularly how to deal with transitions from one state to another. Because obviously if you're driving down a lane and it suddenly becomes a bus lane, then what you do, and then how do you signal these changes to street users? To what extent can be done in vehicle, to what extent must be done on street, and how would you do it? Next, please. So what we're doing in more is we're developing outline protocols for the use of the street, looking at several things. First of all, are there rules or guidance about how to determine priority? Who gets priority where and when? Should we be designating particular parts of the street for particular user types? Now, at the moment, things like e-scooters, all cities in Europe and around the world have had to grapple with, well, how do we allow them? Where do we allow them? And at the moment, we tend to be rather reactive. And we're suggesting you become more proactive, divide the street up into different zones, and actually talk about the performance envelopes of vehicles that will be allowed to operate in those different zones, and therefore encourage inventors to actually design vehicle types that would fit within those different envelopes. Also, there's the issue of autonomous road vehicles and also footway drones and things like that. And what should the rules of the road be? Because these will be coded into these autonomous vehicles, and then they will affect how the road is used in practice, who gets priority, who gives way, and so on. And there's a new ISO standard being developed, TR 4448, actually looking at the curbside and the use of the footway with drones and things like that. And although it sounds a long way from street design, because it will influence the future rules, I think it's very important we're alert to that. So there are some practical implementation issues about consistency rather than spontaneity. And I think what we're thinking of doing is what happened in the early days of traffic signals. We didn't immediately go from fixed timing to interactive spontaneous. We went first of all to a series of plans where we had 2 or 3 different peak hour traffic signal plans and 2 or 3 off peak traffic signal plans, and depending on the conditions on the day, we'd implement one plan or another. And maybe that's the way to go initially with this curbside reallocation. We're also looking at the LED road signs and road markings, how they can best convey information to road users. Will they operate under different lighting conditions and so on? And the crucial issue of dealing safely with transitions from one state to another. Next, please. Just here's 2 or 3 examples, and I've taken them from the UK. This is one example of quite a complicated signalized roundabout. Drivers were getting confused. So as the sequence of lights change, different lights come up in the road surface to sort of guide you through that. So a very simple form of something that's spontaneous using LED and lights and so on. And I've taken 2 examples from the UK now. The next one, please. This is first of all Appy Way. An example of one company that's actually offering online and apps for locating a parking space. So they all have sensors under them, and also when you arrive there, you can just click and then you'll automatically pay for the amount of time you're there. As you go away, it'll be cleared, it'll become available then to somebody else, and also the operators of the network can actually see if people are overstaying, how long they're staying there and things like that. So it's not strictly speaking dynamic, other than the driver has flexibility on how long they stay there, but it's showing that with sensors we have a much better understanding of capability of managing that space. Next, please. Here's another example of a company operating in the UK with their product Kerb, and they're essentially, there's not a fixed bay, there's an area of the road that's digitally allocated, and then you can book that space and you can turn up and you can load there. So there's nothing physical to indicate it other than a sign saying no stopping unless authorized, and the authorization is done digitally in real time. Next, please. The main thing is around the LED signing and lining, which is obviously makes a lot of this possible. We can't rely just on in-vehicle things. Not all vehicles will have it, and obviously pedestrians and cycles won't have that in-vehicle navigation capability. But there are a number of tricky issues there. Because we'll have different users of the same physical space, different times of day, not necessarily defined. In some cases, the footway might become part of the carriageway, and I think Susan will talk about that later on. How do we make sure that they're operating correctly, they're clearly visible at all different times, and we have to do some experiments with lighting conditions and so on. And particularly, how do we record traffic regulations that are in operation at any one time? Now, if you pull up there, you see a sign, if you're given a ticket, you can actually argue, well, look, you look at the sign, I was there within that time. When it's adjusting in real time, how do we have that real legal confidence about what actually was showing, and therefore what the user saw at the time? And as I mentioned, particularly the handover transition periods, they're going to be the most critical thing. So that's it really. So I'll leave. I've got a final slide that says thank you very much with the website on there again, but that's all I'd like to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Very much appreciated. Very clear also. Yeah, I like the way you you combine the drive that comes from, or the reason to have dynamic road space use or to consider it from the side of the authorities, but also highlight the issues that come from the user side, and the idea that you have to be able to understand and manage that from the side of the end user, who has to understand the current conditions or the conditions as they change. Anna has posted a question in that regard also to you. Is this also something you have to consider in public consultations, and how do you how would you go about, how far do you take this in public consultation, in understanding the acceptance, but also the understanding of the measures by end users?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think there's two aspects to that. One is actually in coming up with the different ways in which you might lay out the road space. What are the alternative views for different parts of road space? And in more, at the moment, our 5 cities are actually involved in consultations with a wide range of stakeholder groups to explore how differently the space might be used at different times of day. So what might be the possible variation of options that you'd have available if we have these series of different plans for peak and off-peak. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is the whole issue of the acceptability from the point of view of being a street user. And there we've been rather delayed by COVID, but we're hoping to do it fairly soon, to do some in-house experiments with actually examples of LED signs and road markings, see if people can understand them, because we'd have to display things in a different way to conventionally. And as I say, also deal with the transitions and to come up with different simulations of how you might simulate a transition from a general lane to a bus lane or something in a way that people would be able to understand and felt comfortable with. So there's the issue of laying out the space, and then also how you actually present it to people. So those are 2 elements we're looking at in more.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Pasquale, I've seen your question. We'll take that for the final discussion with the 3 speakers because it can be answered by all 3 speakers, I think. But it's noticed. Okay, thank you, Peter. We move to Anna Craciun. I'm going to change presentations. Anna is in a week of transition between two jobs, but she's here on behalf of Transport for Greater Manchester, former Polis president also, and we have asked her to present an application or a project she has been involved in Manchester, where they have looked in space use, also in view of social distancing and the ability of people to safely move around public spaces. I will share the slides, and then the floor is yours, Anna. Yep.
Thank you.
And if I made a mistake in introducing you, please do make up for that yourself. You can also.
No, that was great.
Okay,
I wasn't
good.
expecting that. Thank you so much, Ivo. Hi, everyone. My name is Craciun, and I work currently for Transport for Greater Manchester. I will shortly join Humanising Autonomy, as I've had a very positive experience working with them as part of this project. So yeah, hopefully you'll hear more from me in my new job in the future. And today I'm going to talk about public space management using predictive artificial intelligence. It actually follows on quite nicely from Peter's presentation. I was a little bit nervous to follow Peter because obviously, you know, he knows almost everything about transport. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a good insight into the project. So you can probably skip past the next slide and go on to the content. I wasn't sure if my camera was going to work, so I felt I had to put a picture of myself there just in case. So today I'm going to talk about some of the sort of contextualization around Greater Manchester to give you a better understanding of our region and what our issues are and also our priorities. I'll also talk a little bit about the 2040 transport strategy that we're currently delivering and we have been working on for the last 5 years. And then I'll go on and talk about the project itself that has actually stemmed from issues that we've faced during COVID-19, but we're now also starting to realize the benefits of the data. So I'll go through some of the example outputs and then the future opportunities that we're considering from the data we've already analysed and the outputs we've already received from Humanising Autonomy. And then I'll move on to something that I think will be very fitting with Peter's presentation, looking at scope expansion of understanding the use of exactly that, dynamic space management, because we've had a lot of new temporary cycleways and footpaths being installed around Greater Manchester. So we're now looking to apply artificial intelligence on our CCTV network so that we can get a better understanding of users' behavior and see if that space reallocation has been an efficient solution. So if we go to the next slide, I'll run through some of the key GM facts and some of our priorities. So hopefully this will give you a good overview. We have about 2.8 million people in Greater Manchester, and Greater Manchester comprises of 10 different local authorities, so it's quite a big region. And of course, because of that, we have a lot of really good stories about transport, but we still have a lot of gaps in our network. And our share of public transport journeys of the overall journeys is still very, very small. And that puts a lot of strain on our network. So managing the network for us at the moment, we have to manage a lot of signals and CCTV, and because they all fall within different districts, it's quite difficult bringing it all together. So that's integration is probably one of the biggest issues that we're facing. Of course, with everything else similar to other cities like congestion, and we have a really big plan for meeting our 2040 strategy and delivering the clean air plan, because at the moment congestion is costing Greater Manchester businesses about 1.3 billion per year, which is a lot, and a lot of those factors are starting to slow down the network, and we're also seeing the different changes in behaviour as a result of COVID-19, such as speeding, which overall has increased by 30% of the network. So not a great time for that to happen, especially as we're reallocating space to active travel. And we're still working really hard to stop these very short car journeys being done. So we have a third of our all the journeys that are less than 1 kilometre still being done by car, which is a bit shocking because I don't know if you've walked 1 kilometre recently. It's a very short distance. So yeah, that's something that we're trying to focus on long-term behavioural change. And I've put here on the left-hand side some of the plans that we're looking to deliver, including our B network, which is our very large vision for a new city region-wide cycling and walking network that will be made up of connected routes of more than 1,000 miles. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll just talk through our vision for 2040. So what we're looking to do at the moment is to move towards having a 50-50 split between sustainable transport and cars. At the moment, it's very heavy and very dominant on cars, particularly single occupancy vehicles. So we're trying to deliver all those different strategies that I showed on the previous slide. And we're also working very much with different sectors to try and bring innovation to life and fast track this. And hopefully, as a result of COVID, we'll be able to fast track this even more. And we've worked a lot closer with the different sectors because, for example, with the health sector, we have very similar targets in supporting active travel because that results in healthier lifestyles and for us a healthier city as well. On the next slide, I've put in our sort of journey to delivering our 2040 delivery plan. And of course, this encompasses everything from looking at our connectivity to Manchester Airport and the different ports dotted around, and also how we're looking to radically transform public transport. The biggest issue at the moment is that the gaps are often found where between sort of towns that are not immediately adjacent to the city centre. So radial routes are quite strong and it's very easy from almost anywhere across Greater Manchester to access Manchester city centre. However, if you're trying to move between different local town centres, there's still a huge gap in the provision of transport and, you know, especially the reliability of that. And that's normally due because well, we don't have a lot of demand. So obviously we have a very deregulated network. So that makes it a little bit difficult to connect it all up. But we have a plan that we're trying to move forward with. And we are also focusing very heavily on electrification. And we're constantly bidding for a lot of funding from government, some of which we get, some of which we're not as successful, but at the moment we are looking to have a GM-wide EV network of rapid chargers. So that project's currently underway and it's being delivered by Amy. So if we go on the next slide, I'll go into perfect. So this is our project that has resulted as part of COVID-19. We started working with Innovate UK, but we've been working with them for the last 5 years on various innovation projects, and they put us in touch with Humanising Autonomy because similar to other public sector organisations, we were having real difficulties in responding to the issues imposed by COVID, and also we didn't really have the means to go out there and install additional cameras, especially during lockdown, where it was very difficult to do anything on the ground. So we're seeking different solutions on how we can optimize the use of our existing assets remotely. And so we got in touch with Humanising Autonomy and decided to bid on this project, which would help us to better manage our transport interchanges. We have 15 across Greater Manchester that we manage, and these are basically multimodal transport hubs that bring together the Metrolink service, heavy rail services, also buses and cycle hubs, and of course taxis. So there's a real sort of intermodality there, and that means that it's very difficult to actually manage the space because we have a lot of different entrances and exits. So previously we would manage the space by doing head counts, by having staff go around the interchanges, and we would sometimes use Bluetooth sensors. So all of these actually needed someone to be on the ground. So we decided that because we have a really good CCTV network, we could use this and collaborate with an AI company that can do behavior analysis on the CCTV we already have without needing to go on the ground. So if we go on to the next slide, perfect. So the project is 6 months long. We actually started exchanging data since May, just to make sure that we could sort of get what we wanted out of this. And we're now well over halfway into the project, and I've put here some outputs. So the biggest thing that we're seeing is that people are increasing the way they move on transport, and actually going back to the old patterns that we used to see. So during lockdown, there was a really heavily populated interpeak. So the morning and evening travel was actually quite low, but now we're seeing a smoothing of peaks, which is great. And we're also seeing an increase in footfall, which is even better because we're starting to see more people back on public transport. And if we go on to the next slide, this is probably the more interesting comparison. So as we were getting the results, we started to analyze the clusters, and we started to realize that actually we need to do more things on the ground as opposed to the soft measures, like, for example, having loads of posters and so on. So you can see, I think, quite clearly the difference between June and July. So once we realized that there was a huge cluster in June, and this is a Bolton interchange, this was around the retail units and the entrance of the interchange. So we implemented one-way systems so that people would actually use the space a little bit better. So then you can see that in July and August, there were also between June and August, the percentage of 2 meter social distancing increased, which is great. And also people were using the space a little bit better. And next slide. So that's all COVID related activities. What we actually are using the data for now, moving forward, is understanding the commercials possibilities, and also how we can utilize this data to update our design standards, look at safety and any incident or near miss prediction. So previously we weren't able to engage with a lot of partners because we didn't have accurate footfall data for these interchanges due to the costs related to it. And also we were heavily relying on getting ticketing data from operators. And I'm sure you all know that's very difficult to get, especially because of different competitive issues. And also recently we did a consultation, quite a wide consultation of the bus reform. So looking at basically coordinating the bus services in a different way, and for TFGM, Transport Greater Manchester, to have more powers over that. So before we're relying on external sources of getting this data. So we weren't able to engage with Amazon to put lockers at these places just because we didn't really have an idea of how the space are being utilized, and we didn't have an accurate footfall count. So now that we do have this data, we can start working together with different partners and make better use of the spaces, because actually they're quite big, and especially in areas where it's not sort of directly on the concourse where people are on board, like boarding and alighting vehicles. There's a lot of space there that's currently just being used for people to sort of travel through as a corridor. So we can make better use of that with pop-up cafes and also targeted advertisement. And at the moment, as part of this project, we're actually testing to see if positive behavioral nudges do work. So we have released positive messaging at all of the participating interchanges in this trial, and there's 3 in total. And we're looking to see if by showing the video, people will change their behavior or not. So that's currently going on this week, and next week we'll take off the video and analyze the behavior after that. So
one more minute to conclude. Perfect. Please. Yep.
Yeah, so if you go on to the next slide. So these are the scope expansion sort of activities that we're currently looking at. So looking at different locations and also different insights that we could get, and how we could integrate the insights from this with existing dashboards that we have. For example, we have dashboards on safety analytics and so on. And next slide is my final one. Perfect. So yeah, we're currently awaiting funding for this. So This is where we're looking to integrate on-street CCTV, so moving on from the indoor use, to understand how well, mostly looking at active travel, but we're actually going to also include vehicles and parked vehicles to see how the change in the junction space will sort of impact people's behavior, and make sure that we analyze anything that causes safety risks like speeding and any near misses. So I can leave it to this, and if you have any further questions, you can always email me, or you can email the innovation team at tfgm.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very interesting. I think it's yeah, the idea of trying to fit the actual design of spaces and to the actual use, or to try to nudge the behavior of people by first understanding the way they use spaces is really interesting. Looking at the last slide, the question I have that springs to mind is also the hierarchy of objectives. I think from Peter's presentation, the idea was really to look at mobility issues. So why do people travel, or what trip purpose do you put in hierarchy of another trip purpose at a certain moment of the day? You bring in the dimension of road safety, and looking also at the strategies that Manchester has established. How do you prioritize these objectives? Would you in, like, for instance, in the situation that you put on the slide, is it road safety that would be predominant here, or would there also be the mobility, the modal choice aspect that comes forward?
I think at the moment the key aspect of, well, the project that we're already doing and the one that we're hoping to do if we get the funding, is to make sure that we actually make travel easier for all users. We've done trials around smart junctions and AI, which have proved that by using artificial intelligence to optimize traffic signals, we got a 10% reduction in congestion. So we already know that, whereas we don't really have the deeper insights into human behavior and how people react to different changes in environment. So, I mean, the next step would basically be just to try and create a better environment for people to walk and cycle, because we have those really big headline figures of, 50-50 split, but really is the environment enabling people to do that. So that's what we're trying to achieve with this, to have deeper insights that could then feed into design standards and guidance.
Okay, thank you. I was muting myself. Thank you, Anna. We move to the final speaker. Don't hesitate to put forward questions in the Q&A box or in the chat function. We're happy to have Susan Claris in the webinar. Susan works for ARUP, and they have developed guidance on flex kerbs, so the flexible use of the kerb space. And Susan, the floor is yours, and I'm all yours to advance your slides when you tell me to.
Great, thank you very much. And I know you want some time left for questions at the end, so I'll do my best to go through this quite rapidly. So when we get to the first slide, the title slide, the picture there is of my own street where I live. And it's really, what I want to emphasize is, although I'm talking about a piece of work called Flex Kerbs that we did a couple of years ago, the whole context for this is more to do with evolving streets, and hopefully the slides will come up soon. I can't see them at the moment, but so if I just talk about my own street, great, it's there now. So I live in North London, and the area where I live, although there's been some element of housing around here since the 1600s, most of the houses on my street grew up in the 1860s when the railway line came along. That's in the right-hand side by the trees in Cutting. And at that point, the street was designed for horse and carriage. And if you can make out the arch between the two for sale signs, that was a steam laundry that was accessed by horse and cart. Then along came cars, and then over the course of the last century, the road changed quite a lot. It became one way because of the level of traffic. It has 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. It has speed bumps. It has different parking restrictions for residents, for people who want to pay, for when there's a football match on at nearby Arsenal. There are some bays that are for car clubs. There are some bays that are for EV charging. There are some bays that are for motorcycles. So a whole range of things has happened to this street. And that's really the context of evolving streets going on. But if we look at the slide in the picture in the next slide, that's of more of a typical street that you might see in London now, or used to see in London. So starting to see a bit more now. And you can see there's a whole host of competing users. There's freight, there's buses, there's cars, there's people walking, there's people cycling, there's a whole mix of restrictions, and all of these people are really vying for space in a very congested setting. And if we look at the next slide, which shows some of the sort of static signage that we have in use now, so with parking restrictions has been noted that can apply to different times, can apply to different vehicles. So we're used to some degree of variation, but it is very much around static, not being dynamic. And then next slide, sometimes you can see we have whole streets closed for special events like Car Free Day, and that shows sort of the different events that can happen. This lovely joyous picture of a slide that people can play in the street. And then the next slide shows a picture of play streets, which we're starting to see. So you close a street for a certain time, maybe a Saturday afternoon, to allow children to go out and play. So we've started seeing these changes over the years. And then next slide, please. The idea of looking at flexible streets was really to take this sort of to the next level. So the next slide shows a picture of West Smithfield Street, which is in the City of London, close to the meat market, which is the building on the left. And you can see it's a hostile environment for people and walking and cycling. It has very wide roads. It has very peaked usage in terms of the City of London was traditionally very quiet at weekends. It was only somewhere where people were during the working week. So we decided to see what could be done instead. So if we move on to the next slide, and hopefully this will flick through on a GIF, we look through the street having different purposes at different times. So it could be peak in terms of commuting. It's not going to show it, I don't think. I might have to talk to this one. Oh no, it is, that's good. So it can be peak in terms of commuting. It can be, it could be at other times. Whoops, that's not working very well, is it? Never mind, not to worry. The idea was that, yeah, that's better. So other times we could focus for business and deliveries at different times of the day. There could be large scale deliveries for the meat market at night. Special events, it could be closed, and weekends it could be given to leisure and social. And we looked at different ways in terms of which that could happen, drawing on some of the issues Peter mentioned about how you lay this out, how you do it. But it was really to look at the principle of doing that. So if you go on to the next slide, the key thing in all this is that this work is guided by a policy framework. I said the difficulty is there's simply not enough space in cities for everyone to travel by car. And the image there is from Transport for London, what they see as indicators of a healthy street. So it's really important that we keep these indicators in mind to actually create good street space. It isn't just giving more space to the people that demand the most, or the people that there is the greatest demand from that might not fit in terms of policy. So then next slide, we move on to flex curbs, which is the particular project I want to talk about today. And on the next slide, you can see what it was. It was a competition that was conducted by the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK called Roads for the Future. And the idea was to generate practical ideas for how UK roads should be designed, managed and used to maximise the benefits of connected and autonomous vehicles. And the timeline was really to look at the street or road in 2050. So it was looking a long way out. This work was done 2 years ago, so 32 years out, which is very hard to predict. We know that now more than ever. But what we wanted to do is not just look at the benefits for connected and autonomous vehicles. We wanted to set it in the context of all street users. So the next slide, the idea that we had was to look at this idea of flex curbs, which is simply to facilitate dynamic use of the curbside, so you can accommodate multiple users at different times of the day or week. And I said critically, this is to be led by policy and informed by demand, not the other way around. So if we look at the next slide, please, that gives a bit more in terms of the detail. So the first thing we did was to select a site, and the site we selected was back in the City of London, and the particular road we looked at was because, crucially, we had data on it. It was a busy high street, and we could do it in collaboration with the City of London, who had all this data. So we looked at a street called Cheapside, which sort of represented a busy high street. Then we had various inputs into the study. So the 4 red circles there show the different levels of policy inputs. So we had the draft London plan, the Mayor's transport strategy, the healthy streets, and then the City of London's own policy document. And we had data. So the 3 graphs show the people movement, the pedestrian movement, with 3 very much peaks in the morning, the evening, and lunchtime. They had the cycle peaks with a very sharp morning peak and then a slightly less in the evening. And then the yellow graph shows the deliveries, and you can see a very different profile. And we set that against the City of London's policy modal hierarchy, where you have people walking at the top. They then had cyclists and buses as being second, then deliveries and servicing, shared passengers and connected autonomous vehicles, and then private cars. And to test this in terms of proof of concept, we looked at dividing the road up into, or the curb up into 5-meter slots to see whether we thought there was discretion. It could be used more flexibly, or it was fixed. For example, was there a particular tree there, which meant that we couldn't do much with that curb line? And then we tested this using Visym to see what the delay might be, and also to vary assumptions. So that was the sort of the main methodology of the study. The next slide shows some of the street level interventions as to how it changes between the different times. So the morning peak with the emphasis on movement and people traveling to work. Hopefully it will then go on to the next one. Is it gonna change? Maybe that GIF's not gonna work. The first one worked. Never mind, it was a similar principle that the morning peak, it could be in a certain way. Lunchtime, again, different usage, evening peak, evening and weekend. So it was really to look at utilizing the space in a different way. And I'll give a link to the report where there is more information about this. So, oh yeah, there we are. So the evening time and then overnight. So really looking at different ways that the street could be used. So if we go to the next one, please. What this is really a sort of summary of the outcomes and benefits, and Peter's touched on quite a lot of these. And you know what our work showed is there could be a wide range of benefits for all street users, including those in connected and autonomous vehicles. That more flexible, dynamic use could help to achieve local policy objectives such as air travel and improved air quality. If the air quality was particularly bad on a certain day, you could actually then use this methodology to close the whole street to traffic to improve air quality. There could be reductions in vehicle delay. It has the possibility to have safer and more comfortable experience for cyclists. You could look at having an extra wide footway for the high footfall, and also more efficient use of curb space. So potentially a lot of good benefits. But if we look at the next slide, which has the challenges, and I said Peter has touched on some of these, there's the whole physical infrastructure and communication. How do you convey this? Is it through lights? How is this done? And I said we were mindful of the fact we were looking, 32 years ahead, so we knew things would be different. So we had to have a degree of optimism in this. But how do you actually convey it to people who are relying on information from their smartphones? How do you convey it to people who are physically walking or driving down the street at the time? How do you make sure that there isn't any disadvantage for people with mobility impairments or with sight impairments? So that was a key part of the study, to make sure that certain groups would not be disadvantaged. There's the obvious one around enforcement. Can you make these measures self-enforcing, or if not, how do you enforce them? What might the charging regime be? For example, if you were giving prime time spots to ensure deliveries. Always concerns about cybersecurity in a scheme like this. The area of government regulations. In the UK, The street regulations are done through legal traffic regulation orders, which are quite clunky and lengthy and not really fit for purpose. So it would be what would be the regulatory framework. And then, of course, how much does this all cost? What are the funding sources for these types of things? So that was the study that we did. I said it was a competition. I think there was something like 90 entries. We were shortlisted to the final 5, and then we had 3 months to actually work this proof of concept up. And sadly, we didn't win, but we were happy with the work we did. And as can be seen in the next slide, it attracted a lot of media attention, which we weren't expecting in the national media, the Times and the Sunday Times, and etc. Also in the transport press, which I guess is more expected. And as I said, we work with a number of partners actually throughout doing the work. For example, Guide Dogs for the Blind, because of particular concerns around the impact of people with visual impairments. So that was where that study was 2 years ago. And to conclude, if we can just go to the next slide, in terms of where we are now, I wonder actually whether we start to look at flexible streets or evolving streets in a different way. Because all of that work was done on the sort of supposed, or the anticipation that traffic will continue growing. But this year we've seen such a different change. We had the massive drop in traffic levels of all sorts back earlier in the year, with traffic levels sort of back to where they were in 1955. And then we've seen them creep up over the course of the summer to almost be back where they were beforehand, or maybe even in some places ahead. But I think actually what the focus now is on is looking far more simply, and these are 2 images, again, my local borough, Islington, on low traffic neighbourhoods, saying that if you can take out all the through traffic and actually discourage a lot of those short trips, maybe you don't need the sort of the fancy flexible use of the street. You actually lower the traffic levels so much that people use the street how they want to. And you see people walking and people on mobility scooters just using the carriageway because the traffic levels are so low. You have school streets, the colourful image on the right, where there are different restrictions at school pickup and school drop-off times. And there's very clear data coming out that shows that the amount of traffic in the UK on residential streets has increased dramatically since 2008, 2009, when smartphones became commonplace. So traffic on residential streets has almost doubled, whereas the traffic on the main roads has actually, remained mostly the same or gone down. So what I wanted to leave you with, really, the thought is you can have the really high-tech flexible streets, or you can have the lower, try and get rid of most of the traffic and just let the people use the space accordingly. So the final slide just has the link to the project report if anyone wants to follow up on it, and my contact details. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. I will bring back the camera, and I hope that the other speakers can also do that. I have two questions. I don't see questions in the Q&A nor in the chat, so I'll bring up the question that Pasquale posted, a colleague of mine posted earlier on, and that's the issue. It brings forward the issue of social equity, the idea that the distribution of space in many cases also has to do with power, so that the it's not equal, space is not equally distributed amongst the different users. How do your activities try to solve that issue, to let's say, to empower also those road users who are who don't visibly have an economic interest, or who are not high up in the perceived hierarchy of road users? So
I'm happy to make a quick comment on that.
Okay, good.
That would
Thanks,
be helpful.
Suzanne.
So yeah, I think it's looking at the road users, but then even within those road users, look at who is using the facility and who is not. So we've just done a research piece called Cycling for Everyone, which is looking at the impact on, or looking at who cycles at the moment. And it's dominated by a very narrow demographic, which is typically white males aged 17 to 50. But it shows there's a lot of unmet demand from other groups, but cycling is just not inclusive at the moment. So I think it's really important not just to look at it in terms of the social justice, in terms of the different modes, but look actually you know, between those modes. And I think traditionally we've counted traffic, we've counted people, and I said if there are 100 people using a cycle lane, well, we think that's twice as good as 50 people using the cycle lane. I think what we need to do now is actually look crucially at who is using it, but in particular who is not, and it should be looking at schemes as to how they can address inequity and how they can improve things. And I think that's the next stage in terms of looking at our work.
Peter?
Yeah, three things. I think, first of all, COVID has actually been very interesting because it's changed dramatically the relative weight given to different street users. So now pedestrians, street activities, cycling is much more important relative in many areas relative to car traffic. So it did show the historic thing, but also shows that political priorities can change and that can be rebalanced quite dramatically. Within More, we've had a piece of work done on contested space, actually looking at the power structures behind the allocation of space and so on. There's some interesting results there. And thirdly, in the appraisal part of our toolkit, one of the forms of appraisal is multi-criteria analysis, where you can vary the weight you give to different street users. So that's a way of sort of saying how might you give preference to some design over others as you change relative priority. The other thing I think to bear in mind as well that's important is that we can go out and more measure what's happening on the street, but it's also what's not happening, because at the moment the current streets are actually deterring some people from being there. So it's more the Yangale idea in a way that you want streets that actually all user groups feel comfortable, all ages, genders, etc. feel comfortable using. So we must bear that in mind too. Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. We had a webinar on inclusive mobility, where the projects that are part of that of the cluster working on that in Demo, Dignity and Trips, were also targeting specifically the non-users to understand the barriers of using mobility services or public space. Anna, do you have any insights on this issue, the social equality issues?
I mean, I don't know if it's more of an insight. I think it's probably just a moan that I always have internally at TFGM, is that whenever we design something, we often go out and do surveys. So, for example, when we look at upgrading bus stops or bus interchanges, we normally survey people that are currently using the service, and thus we miss a huge market of people that could be potential customers that we don't include in this. And you know, this is becoming more of a vicious cycle, really, of, you know, obviously people that are using the bus at the moment at interchanges that to us are substandard. They've kind of, to them it's you know, it does the job, so they're not going to be particularly negative about what's there because they really need it to be able to make those key journeys. Whereas if we're looking at behavior in a sense of understanding all modes and all users in a road space, then we can actually see people's true behaviors as well, because obviously sometimes when people answer surveys, they're also saying, like, you know, a perceived reality of themselves, saying that, you know, oh yes, of course I cycle 20% of the time because, you know, it's healthy and I should do that, but really they don't do that at all. So I think what's important now is moving to having a more holistic understanding of behaviors of people with different abilities as well to cycle and walk, so that we can get rid of all those really short car journeys that just seems to be the pests of causing all this sort of emission and congestion and clogging up all the cities. So yeah, hopefully we'll see a lot more new projects that are looking at different ways of collecting new data so that we can have a better understanding and work with, you know, like micro sims for pedestrians, so that we can understand exactly, you know, how can we create a better environment for everyone. Yeah, okay. Definitely focus more on active travel.
yeah, sounds good. I have a final question, not to run too late, which might be a bit of a strange question, but I'm wondering, I brought you together, and only after finalizing the speakers list, I saw that we have 3 UK speakers on the panel. Why is that so, you think? Why is this a topic? Why is this topic specifically on the radar in the UK? also because all of you, the three of you, are also in touch with continental Europe. Let's say you understand a bit what's living there. What's different that this makes that this is high on the agenda in the UK.
Well, perhaps I can give a quick comment to that then.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I just happen to be coordinating a European project, so we have partners in many countries. So really, most of what we're doing is being done outside the UK.
That's true. Yeah.
European partners, so that's slightly misrepresentation of the situation. I guess what it might be is that, I mean, as a Londoner, if I go to Paris or Madrid, Barcelona, many other European cities, the main streets are much wider than ours. And therefore, I think probably we face those more on our high streets and things. We face those challenges more intensively, I think, probably than would be the case in a number of other cities.
Suzanne, any ideas from your side?
I think that's correct. I think also we do suffer from a more fragmented decision making and operation of many of our transport systems in our cities than some other continental European cities. So I think that makes that planning and coordination of space more challenging. So maybe that increases the problems that we face.
Okay, Anna, final thought on that also?
I mean, thank you for including me in the UK list.
Of course,
I'm actually Romanian, so
I know, but
of many different nationalities. I mean, one of my observations, sort of being in the UK for the last 10 years, is that I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've noticed that every region and every city is so different that you can't really apply a blanket approach of measures across the UK, whereas I think that's completely different in Romania, because what would probably work in my hometown Brasov would probably work across many cities, but in the UK there just seems to be that really sort of individual culture that each place has, and that's probably because of the very drastic geographies that you could get across the UK, which is a fairly small country. So I think it's just a competitiveness and also the traditional use of space that seems to have a really big impact in this day as well.
Okay, interesting. And I think it gives a very good basis also for us to learn from you, but also to keep on learning even after the horrible deadline that is approaching us. We were very happy to have you in this panel. I would like to conclude the presentation with the webinar with a couple of thoughts. I specifically liked the idea of Susan, who said, and I tried to get rid of this box in the screen, policy-led and informed by demand. So the idea that if we continuing on the trajectory of making better use of public space and bringing in an element of dynamic or revolving use over time of this public space, this needs to be informed by policies. In the EU context, the SUMP comes up then, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, which sets out the strategies that cities will follow to create a framework for that use of space. And then the informed by demand, which is also multifaceted, the idea that we reach out to stakeholders to understand their needs, their capabilities, to understand measures, but also that we look into actually measuring and monitoring the actual space use, examples given by Peter, but also presented by Anna. I also really appreciate this idea of bringing in the low-tech dimension next to the high-tech dimension. And indeed, I think if we want to make this mainstream in city streets, we need models that are affordable, because this is currently not a cost for cities. I mean, it's not something that is budgeted. So we need to find ways to make this happen through an entire toolbox of measures. And for that toolbox, we also turn to more as a project. Next webinar on the radar is this Thursday at 2 o'clock, when we talk with the projects Gecko and Sprout about the future of mobility in cities, designing policy responses to mobility innovation. And for the real urban mobility aficionados, we hope to meet you at the Polis conference, which is taking place virtually from 30 November to 3 December, and in cooperation with the host Arnhem-Nijmegen, and also with a program that will be out in the coming weeks. So that's it for today. Thanks to the speakers again, and we hope to stay in touch. And all the best. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.
invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.